being connected to the viscera and inner surface of the parietes by means of areolar tissue, termed the subserous areolar tissue. The parietal portion is loosely connected with the facial lining of the abdomen and pelvis, but is more closely adherent to the undersurface of the diaphragm and also in the middle line of the abdomen. The space between the parietal and visceral layers of the peritoneum is named the peritoneal cavity. But under normal conditions, this cavity is merely a potential one, since the parietal and visceral layers are in contact. The peritoneal cavity gives off a large diverticulum, the omental bursa, which is situated behind the stomach and adjoining structures. The neck of communication between the cavity and the bursa is termed the epipleutic foramen, foramen of Winslow. Formerly, the main portion of the cavity was described as the greater, and the omental bursa the lesser sac. The peritoneum differs from the other serous membranes of the body in presenting a much more complex arrangement, and one that can be clearly understood only by following the changes which take place in the digestive tube during its development. To trace the membrane from one viscus to another, and from the viscera to the parietes, it is necessary to follow its continuity in the vertical and horizontal directions, and it will be found simpler to describe the main portion of the cavity and the omental bursa separately. Vertical disposition of the main peritoneal cavity, greater sac. It is convenient to trace this from the back of the abdominal wall at the level of the umbilicus. In following the peritoneum upward from this level, it is seen to be reflected around a fibrous cord, the ligamentum teres, obliterated umbilical vein, which reaches from the umbilicus to the undersurface of the liver. This reflection forms a somewhat triangular fold, the falciform ligament of the liver, attaching the upper and anterior surfaces of the liver to the diaphragm and abdominal wall. With the exception of the line of attachment of this ligament, the peritoneum covers the whole of the undersurface of the anterior part of the diaphragm, and is continued from it onto the upper surface of the right lobe of the liver as the superior layer of the coronary ligament, and onto the upper surface of the left lobe as the superior layer of the left triangular ligament of the liver, covering the upper and anterior surfaces of the liver. It is continued around its sharp margin onto the undersurface, where it presents the following relations. A. It covers the undersurface of the right lobe and is reflected from the back part of this onto the right suprarenal gland and the upper extremity of the right kidney, forming in this situation the inferior layer of the coronary ligament. A special fold, the hepatorenal ligament, is frequently present between the inferior surface of the liver and the front of the kidney. From the kidney it is carried downward to the duodenum and the right colic flexure and medial ward in front of the inferior vena cava, where it is continuous with the posterior wall of the omental bursa. Between the two layers of the coronary ligament there is a large triangular surface of the liver devoid of peritoneal covering. This is named the bare area of the liver, and is attached to the diaphragm by areolar tissue. Toward the right margin of the liver the two layers of the coronary ligament gradually approach each other, and ultimately fuse to form a small triangular fold connecting the right lobe of the liver to the diaphragm, and named the right triangular ligament of the liver. The apex of the triangular bare area corresponds with the point of meeting of the two layers of the coronary ligament, its base with the fossa for the inferior vena cava. B. It covers the lower surface of the quadrat lobe, the under and lateral surfaces of the gallbladder, and the undersurface and posterior border of the left lobe. It is then reflected from the upper surface of the left lobe to the diaphragm as the inferior layer of the left triangular ligament, and from the porta of the liver and the fossa for the ductus venosus to the lesser curvature of the stomach, and the first 2.5 centimeters of the duodenum as the anterior layer of the hepatogastric and the hepatoduodenal ligaments, which together constitute the lesser omentum. If this layer of the lesser omentum be followed to the right, it will be found to turn around the hepatic artery, bile duct, and portal vein, and become continuous with the anterior wall of the omental bursa, forming a free folded edge of the peritoneum. Traced downward, it covers the antero-superior surface of the stomach and the commencement of the duodenum. and is carried down into a large free fold, known as the gastrocolic ligament or greater omentum. Reaching the free margin of this fold, it is reflected upward to cover the under and posterior surfaces of the transverse colon, and thence to the posterior abdominal wall as the inferior layer of the transverse mesocolon. It reaches the abdominal wall at the head and anterior border of the pancreas, is then carried down over the lower part of the head and over the inferior surface of the pancreas on the superior mesenteric vessels, and thence to the small intestine as the anterior layer of the mesentery. It encircles the intestine and subsequently may be traced as the posterior layer of the mesentery, upward and backward to the abdominal wall. From this it sweeps down over the aorta into the pelvis, where it invests the sigmoid colon, its reduplication forming the sigmoid mesocolon. Leaving first the sides and then the front of the rectum, it is reflected on to the seminal vesicles and the fundus of the urinary bladder and, after covering the upper surface of this viscus, is carried along the medial and lateral umbilical ligaments onto the back of the abdominal wall to the level from which a start was made. Between the rectum and the bladder it forms, in the male, a pouch, the rectovesical excavation, the bottom of which is slightly below the level of the upper ends of the vesiculae seminales, i.e., about 7.5 centimeters from the orifice of the anus. When the bladder is distended, the peritoneum is carried up with the expanded viscus so that a considerable part of the anterior surface of the latter lies directly against the abdominal wall, without the intervention of the peritoneal membrane, pre-vesical space of Retzius. In the female, the peritoneum is reflected from the rectum over the posterior vaginal fornix to the cervix and body of the uterus, forming the rectouterine excavation, pouch of Douglas. It is continued over the intestinal surface and fundus of the uterus on its vesical surface, which it covers as far as the junction of the body and cervix uteri, and then to the bladder, forming here a second but shallower pouch, the vesicouterine excavation. It is also reflected from the sides of the uterus to the lateral walls of the pelvis as two expanded folds, the broad ligaments of the uterus, in the free margin of each of which is the uterine tube. Vertical disposition of the omental bursa, lesser peritoneal sac. A start may be made in this case on the posterior abdominal wall at the anterior border of the pancreas. From this region, the peritoneum may be followed upward over the pancreas onto the inferior surface of the diaphragm, and thence onto the caudate lobe and the caudate process of the liver to the fossa from the ductus venosus and the porta of the liver. Traced to the right, it is continuous over the inferior vena cava with the posterior wall of the main cavity. From the liver it is carried downward to the lesser curvature of the stomach and the commencement of the duodenum as the posterior layer of the lesser omentum, and is continuous on the right around the hepatic artery, bile duct, and portal vein, with the anterior layer of this omentum. The posterior layer of the lesser omentum is carried down as a covering for the posterior inferior surfaces of the stomach and the commencement of the duodenum, and is continued downward as the deep layer of the gastrocolic ligament or greater omentum. From the free margin of this fold, it is reflected upward on itself to the anterior and superior surfaces of the transverse colon, and thence as the superior layer of the transverse mesocolon to the anterior border of the pancreas, the level from which a start was made. It will be seen that the loop formed by the wall of the omental bursa below the transverse colon follows, and is closely applied to, the deep surface of that formed by the peritoneum of the main cavity, and that the greater omentum or large fold of the peritoneum which hangs in front of the small intestine therefore consists of 4 layers, 2 anterior and 2 posterior separated by the potential cavity of the omental bursa. End of section 16.